What if I told you that a single event, one catastrophic moment in history, set human progress back by centuries? Picture this: an entire world of knowledge, the sum of ancient genius, gathered under one roof. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building filled with scrolls. It was the beating heart of human understanding, a place where the brightest minds of the ancient world came to study, debate, and push the boundaries of what was possible. From the precise movements of the stars to the secrets of the human body, from the foundations of geometry to the deepest questions of philosophy, this library held it all. And then, in a matter of moments, it was gone. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria wasn't just the loss of books, it was the erasure of countless ideas, discoveries, and potential advancements that might have reshaped our world far sooner. Think about how different our lives would be if that knowledge had survived. Could we have unlocked the mysteries of electricity centuries earlier? Might medicine have advanced to combat diseases that once ravaged entire populations? The ripple effects of this one tragedy are almost impossible to measure because we'll never know what could have been. But what we do know is this: the burning of the Library of Alexandria didn't just destroy the past, it altered the future. It created a gap in human understanding, a dark age of lost wisdom that took generations to rebuild. And yet, even in its absence, the legend of the library lingers, a haunting reminder of how fragile knowledge can be. Today, we're going to journey back to that pivotal moment, to explore how the fall of this great institution changed the course of civilization itself. We'll uncover the stories of the scholars who walked its halls, the texts that vanished forever, and the staggering impact this loss had on science, culture, and the very way we understand our world. This isn't just a story about fire and ruin, it's about what happens when the light of knowledge is dimmed, and how humanity struggles to reignite it. So let's step into history together and discover how the destruction of the Library of Alexandria didn't just end an era, it reshaped the future in ways we're still grappling with today. To understand why the loss of the Library of Alexandria was so devastating, we first need to grasp just how revolutionary this institution was in its prime. Picture a city at the crossroads of the ancient world, Alexandria, a bustling hub of trade, culture, and ideas. Here, under the ambitious vision of the Ptolemaic rulers, the library wasn't just built to store knowledge, it was designed to conquer it. The Ptolemies didn't simply collect scrolls, they launched a relentless campaign to gather every written work in existence. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbor were searched, not for spices or gold, but for books. Any scrolls found were copied by teams of scribes, with the originals kept in the library's vast collection and the copies returned to their owners. This wasn't just a library, it was a knowledge empire. At its peak, the library housed an estimated 500,000 scrolls, a staggering number for the ancient world. Within its walls, scholars debated the shape of the Earth, calculated the circumference of our planet with astonishing accuracy, and laid the foundations for modern mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Euclid developed his groundbreaking theories of geometry here. Archimedes, visiting from Syracuse, exchanged ideas that would later revolutionize engineering. Even the great physician Eratosthenes dissected human cadavers in the library's halls, making discoveries about the nervous system that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. This wasn't just a place of learning, it was a crucible of innovation, where the brightest minds of the ancient world pushed humanity forward. But what truly set the Library of Alexandria apart was its mission. Unlike other great libraries of antiquity, which served rulers or religious institutions, this one was dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. The Ptolemies funded scholars regardless of their nationality or beliefs, creating a melting pot of ideas where Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, Persian, and Indian thinkers could collaborate. It was a beacon of intellectual freedom in a world often divided by borders and dogma. And that's what makes its loss so haunting, not just the physical destruction of scrolls, but the silencing of a conversation that had the potential to reshape civilization centuries ahead of its time. The library's influence extended far beyond its walls. Its scholars created the first system of cataloging knowledge, a precursor to modern libraries. They standardized texts, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost to time. And perhaps most importantly, they proved that when knowledge is centralized, shared, and celebrated, humanity leaps forward. That's why the burning of the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a tragedy for the ancient world, it was a wound to human progress itself, because when those flames consumed its halls, they didn't just destroy the past. They stole countless futures. Imagine walking through the halls of the Library of Alexandria at the height of its glory, every shelf lined with scrolls containing ideas so advanced they wouldn't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. This wasn't just a repository for books, it was a living laboratory where the boundaries of human knowledge were pushed daily. Take Eratosthenes, for example, the scholar who not only served as the library's chief librarian, but also calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing precision using nothing more than a stick, the sun, and sheer brilliance. His method was so accurate that modern measurements differ by less than 2%. Yet after the library's destruction, this groundbreaking work vanished from the world's collective memory, and Europeans spent centuries believing the Earth was flat, a staggering regression in understanding. Then there's Euclid, whose Elements laid the foundation for geometry as we know it. His systematic approach to mathematical proofs became the gold standard for logical reasoning, influencing thinkers from Newton to Einstein. But here's the chilling thought. We only know Euclid's work today because a handful of copies survived outside Alexandria. How many other mathematical breakthroughs were lost in the flames, leaving later scholars to painstakingly reinvent what had already been discovered? The same tragedy applies to medicine, where Herophilus' pioneering studies of the human body, including the distinction between arteries and veins, were so advanced that they wouldn't be matched again until the Renaissance. Without the library's vast medical archives, centuries of healers operated in the dark, relying on guesswork instead of the rigorous science that had once thrived in Alexandria. Perhaps the greatest loss, though, wasn't just the individual works but the culture of collaboration they represented. The library's scholars didn't work in isolation. They built upon each other's ideas, debated theories, and refined their understanding through dialogue. When the library burned, that chain of intellectual progress was shattered. Think of it like a candle snuffed out. Not only is the light gone, but the flame can't be passed to the next generation. For centuries afterward, scientific inquiry was fragmented, with pockets of knowledge scattered across monasteries and private collections, inaccessible to most. The loss set in motion a domino effect. Without the library's central repository, discoveries became harder to share, verify, and expand upon. What took the ancient scholars decades to uncover would take medieval thinkers centuries to rediscover. And then there are the works we'll never know existed. The library's catalog alone was said to span 120 scrolls, a detailed index of humanity's collective wisdom up to that point. How many plays by Sophocles, histories of forgotten empires, or treatises on astronomy and engineering turned to ash? The tragedy isn't just what we know was lost, but the untold ideas that vanished without a trace. It's as if someone ripped entire chapters from the story of human progress, leaving us to piece together the plot from fragments. Every time a modern archaeologist unearths a single surviving manuscript from the ancient world, it's a reminder of how much more once existed and how different our world might be if those shelves had survived. The legacy of the library's destruction isn't just measured in lost scrolls, but in the alternate futures that were erased. What if Archimedes' complete works on mechanics had survived, potentially accelerating the Industrial Revolution by over a millennium? What if the medical texts burned in the fire had contained cures for diseases that plagued humanity for centuries? The library's fall didn't just rob the ancient world, it deprived every generation that followed. And that's why, even 2,000 years later, the story of Alexandria's lost knowledge remains one of history's most poignant lessons about the fragility of enlightenment. The sheer scale of the Library of Alexandria's collection is almost unimaginable by ancient standards. Picture a treasure so vast it could fill a modern football stadium scroll upon scroll, each one containing knowledge painstakingly gathered from across the known world. Historians believe its shelves held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 works, an astronomical number for a time when every single word had to be copied by hand. This wasn't just a random assortment of texts, it was a deliberate, nearly obsessive attempt to gather every piece of human understanding under one roof. Poetry from India, astronomical charts from Babylon, medical texts from Egypt, philosophical works from Greece. Nothing was considered too obscure or too ambitious to include. Among its most priceless holdings were works we now know only by their absence. The lost plays of Sophocles, of which only 7 survive today, once filled entire sections. Imagine how our understanding of ancient drama might change if we could read the other 113. The library also housed original medical writings by Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, whose theories on disease and anatomy were far ahead of their time. But it wasn't just famous names that made the collection invaluable. Countless anonymous scholars contributed scrolls on agriculture, engineering, and even early forms of chemistry practical knowledge that could have transformed daily life for millions had it survived. What's truly staggering is how much we don't know was lost. The library's catalog alone, a masterpiece of organization, listed titles and summaries of works across every discipline. Some were so specialized they defy modern categories: treatises on dream interpretation, manuals for deciphering animal behavior, even theories about the nature of time that might have altered the course of physics. Entire languages and cultures were preserved in its archives, offering glimpses of civilizations that otherwise left no trace. When the library burned, it wasn't just books that vanished. It was whole ways of thinking, entire branches of study that disappeared from history. Consider for a moment how differently science might have developed if those texts had survived. The ancient Greeks were already experimenting with steam power and mechanical devices. What if their blueprints had been preserved instead of lost for centuries? The library's destruction didn't just erase knowledge, it reset the clock on human progress, forcing later generations to rediscover truths that had once been common wisdom. And that's what makes this loss so profound. It's not just about what we know was destroyed, but about the infinite possibilities that vanished with it. The library's ruins are a silent monument to all the questions we'll never get to ask because the answers turned to ash 2,000 years ago. Now, let's turn to the fire itself, the moment when this beacon of learning met its tragic end. The story of the library's destruction is wrapped in mystery and conflicting accounts, but one thing is certain: its fall wasn't just an accident of history. It was the result of forces far darker than flame. The flames that engulfed Alexandria's harbor in 48 BCE were never meant to touch the library. Julius Caesar, locked in a desperate struggle for control of Egypt, ordered his troops to set fire to the fleet of his rival, Pompey, but the wind had other plans. The blaze leaped from the ships to the docks, then raced toward the city, and toward the greatest repository of knowledge the ancient world had ever known. By the time the fire burned itself out, an estimated 40,000 scrolls lay in ashes. The loss was catastrophic, but what makes this moment even more tragic is how unnecessary it was. This wasn't a deliberate attack on knowledge. It was collateral damage in a political power struggle, a reminder of how easily human conflict can erase centuries of progress in an instant. Caesar himself later expressed regret for the destruction, though his account downplayed the scale, but the damage was done. Among the lost works were irreplaceable originals, manuscripts penned by thinkers whose names we'll never know, records of experiments and observations that vanished before their time. The fire didn't just destroy books, it severed threads of thought, breaking chains of ideas that might have led to breakthroughs in medicine, astronomy, or engineering. And while the library itself survived rebuilding and continuing its work for centuries, this was the first crack in its foundation, a warning of how fragile knowledge can be when it stands in the path of ambition. What's often overlooked is how this moment changed the library's role in the ancient world. Before the fire, Alexandria had been the undisputed center of learning, a magnet for scholars across continents. Afterward, though still prestigious, it began to lose its monopoly on knowledge. Other cities, sensing vulnerability, started building their own collections. The fire scattered not just scrolls but influence, diluting the concentrated brilliance that had once thrived in Alexandria's halls. And perhaps most hauntingly, the event set a dangerous precedent. If the library could burn once, it could burn again. The siege of 48 BCE was just the beginning. Over the centuries that followed, the library would face wave after wave of destruction, each one chipping away at what remained, each one pushing humanity further from the heights its scholars had once reached. But none of those later attacks would have been quite so devastating if not for this first fateful blaze. Because when Caesar's fire burned those 40,000 scrolls, it didn't just erase knowledge. It sent a message that even the greatest achievements of civilization are no match for the chaos of history. And that message would echo far beyond Alexandria, shaping the fate of knowledge for generations to come. Yet even in its diminished state, the library remained a beacon. Its scholars continued their work, piecing together fragments, copying what could be saved. They understood something we often forget, that knowledge isn't just stored in books, but in the act of preserving, sharing, and building upon ideas. The fire had taken much, but it couldn't extinguish the curiosity that had built the library in the first place. That resilience, more than anything, is what makes the story of Caesar's siege so poignant, because it shows us that even in the face of loss, the pursuit of understanding doesn't end. It adapts, it persists, and sometimes, against all odds, it finds a way to begin again. Religious and political turmoil would deliver the final blows to the Library of Alexandria long after Caesar's fire. By the 4th century CE, the city had become a battleground for competing ideologies, with Christian zealots targeting what they saw as remnants of pagan influence. In 391 CE, riots erupted under the direction of Theophilus, the city's bishop, who ordered the destruction of the Serapeum, a temple annex that housed a portion of the library's surviving collection. The attack wasn't just about religion. It was a deliberate strike against the diversity of thought the library had once championed. Scrolls containing ancient Greek philosophy, Egyptian astronomy, and Persian medicine were torn apart or burned, deemed dangerous to the rising dominance of a single worldview. The loss went beyond the physical destruction. This marked a turning point in how knowledge itself was valued. Where the Ptolemies had once sought to gather every perspective, Now entire schools of thought were erased because they didn't align with the prevailing beliefs. The scholars who might have preserved these works fled or fell silent, scattering to distant corners of the Roman Empire. Imagine the irony. A library built to unite human understanding was now fractured by the very divisions it had tried to transcend. And the damage wasn't just to books, it was to the idea that knowledge could exist without allegiance to dogma. 3 centuries later, another wave of conquest swept through Alexandria. When Muslim forces took the city in 641 CE, accounts suggest the remnants of the library's collection were used to fuel the bathhouses of the city for months. Whether this was a deliberate act of erasure or simply a pragmatic reuse of neglected materials is still debated, but the outcome was the same. The last surviving traces of the library's vast archives, works that had somehow survived centuries of upheaval, were now gone forever. What makes these final blows so devastating is the cumulative effect. With each attack, humanity didn't just lose scrolls, we lost the chance to build on centuries of insight. Think of it like a tower where every brick represents a discovery. The library's destruction didn't just remove a few bricks, it collapsed entire floors, forcing later generations to rebuild from the ground up. Medicine regressed as anatomical knowledge vanished. Astronomy stalled without the star charts of Alexandria. Even something as fundamental as the scientific method, the idea of testing hypotheses through observation, had to be rediscovered centuries later because the works that first proposed it were ash. The greatest tragedy isn't just what we know was lost, but how these acts reshaped the very trajectory of human progress. The library's fate teaches us that knowledge isn't just fragile, it's vulnerable to the whims of power, ideology, and even indifference. And yet, in its absence, the legend of Alexandria grew, becoming a symbol of what humanity could achieve, and a warning of how easily it could all slip away. The scientific treasures lost in the flames of Alexandria weren't just outdated theories, they were visionary ideas centuries ahead of their time. Take the work of Hero of Alexandria, whose manuscripts described steam-powered engines and mechanical devices that could have jump-started an industrial revolution in the ancient world. His designs for automatic temple doors and coin-operated machines weren't just curiosities. They were blueprints for technologies that wouldn't become commonplace until the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet after the library's destruction, these breakthroughs vanished from collective memory, forcing humanity to wait nearly 2,000 years to reinvent what had already been conceived. Even more staggering were the astronomical texts that perished. Aristarchus of Samos had proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, placing the Sun at the center, nearly 18 centuries before Copernicus. His calculations, preserved in Alexandria, were so precise that they challenged the Earth-centered view dominating medieval science. But without access to these works, later astronomers had to start from scratch, their progress slowed by dogma and guesswork. The same tragedy unfolded in medicine, where the library's texts documented surgical techniques and anatomical knowledge that wouldn't resurface until Vesalius pioneered modern dissection in the 1500s. Generations of patients suffered needlessly because critical medical insights had turned to ash. Perhaps most haunting is how these losses created a domino effect across disciplines. Mathematics, engineering, even early chemistry, each field suffered setbacks that rippled through time. Archimedes' treatises on hydraulics and mechanics, partially preserved elsewhere, hint at how much more might have been lost. His famous method of mechanical theorems, rediscovered in a palimpsest in 1906, shows he was on the verge of inventing calculus 2 millennia before Newton and Leibniz. But with the bulk of his work destroyed, humanity had to traverse a much longer path to the same discoveries. The void left by these missing texts wasn't just an absence of facts, it was a rupture in the very way knowledge accumulates. Normally, each generation stands on the shoulders of the last, building upward. But the library's destruction forced civilization to climb the same hills over and over, wasting centuries retracing steps that ancient scholars had already mapped. This wasn't merely a delay, it altered the trajectory of human progress, redirecting resources toward rediscovery rather than advancement. And then there's the philosophical cost, the loss of entire schools of thought that might have reshaped how we see the world. The library didn't just house science, it nurtured debates about ethics, governance, and the nature of reality itself. When its collections burned, we didn't just lose answers, we lost ways of asking questions. The works of Democritus, who theorized atoms as the building blocks of matter, survived only in fragments. Stoic and Epicurean texts that could have enriched modern philosophy were reduced to second-hand summaries. Even the library's famed interdisciplinarity, the cross-pollination of ideas between cultures, was silenced, leaving later thinkers to reconstruct dialogues that had once flourished in Alexandria's halls. This philosophical void might be the hardest loss to measure, because it's not just about what was written, but about the conversations that never happened. How many ethical frameworks, political theories, or metaphysical insights died with the scholars who frequented those halls? The library's true value wasn't just in preserving knowledge, it was in creating the conditions for new knowledge to emerge. And that's what makes its destruction so profound. When the flames consumed its scrolls, they didn't just erase the past, they closed doors to futures we'll never know. Among the ashes of the Library of Alexandria lay philosophical works that could have rewritten the foundations of Western thought. The Stoic scrolls lost in the flames weren't just copies of familiar teachings, they contained entire branches of reasoning that never reached future generations. Imagine if Marcus Aurelius had access to earlier, more radical Stoic texts that challenged his own meditations. Or consider the lost dialogues of Archimedes, the philosopher who famously argued both sides of every debate to prove nothing could be known with certainty. His absence from the surviving record left later thinkers without one of antiquity's most compelling challenges to dogmatism. The library also housed groundbreaking works on governance, including treatises that explored democracy beyond Athens' model. Fragments suggest some Alexandrian scholars were analyzing early forms of representation and collective decision, making ideas that might have reshaped political evolution had they survived. Instead, medieval Europe inherited a narrowed vision of power, one less informed by the diversity of thought once curated in those halls. Even more tragic is the loss of cross-cultural philosophy. Persian ethical texts, Indian metaphysical debates, and Egyptian wisdom literature that could have woven richer threads into the tapestry of human reasoning. But the greatest void lies in the unknown. The library's catalog mentions titles like On the Nature of Justice and The Dialogue of Time and Soul, works whose contents we can only guess at. These weren't just books, they were conversations cut short, intellectual pathways that might have led humanity down entirely different roads of understanding. When the fire consumed them, it didn't just erase words, it collapsed entire dimensions of thought, leaving later philosophers to rebuild from fragments. Now consider medicine, where the loss was measured not in abstract ideas but in human lives. The library's medical archives contained centuries of observation, detailed case studies, surgical techniques, and herbal remedies compiled from Greece to India. Herophilus' groundbreaking work on the nervous system, which correctly identified the brain as the seat of consciousness, was just the beginning. Scrolls on germ theory precursors, wound sterilization, even early anesthesia vanished before their time. One surviving account describes a text called the Book of Fevers, which categorized illnesses by symptoms and proposed targeted treatments, a system that wouldn't reappear until the 19th century. Without these guides, medieval physicians often resorted to bloodletting and superstition. The setback wasn't just academic, it condemned millions to suffering that might have been alleviated. Even basic surgical knowledge, like the use of ligatures to stop bleeding, had to be painfully rediscovered millennia later. The most haunting losses are the ones we can't quantify: the cures that might have been found, the epidemics that could have been contained. When the library burned, it didn't just take parchment and ink. It stole futures where children survived plagues, where mothers lived through childbirth, where pain was understood rather than feared. That's the true cost of knowledge lost, not just what was, but what might have been. The medical texts lost in Alexandria's flames weren't just scrolls, they were lifelines. Herophilus' meticulous dissections had revealed the difference between sensory and motor nerves, a breakthrough that wouldn't resurface until the Renaissance. His work on the brain's ventricles laid the foundation for neurology, yet these insights vanished for 1,500 years, leaving physicians to treat seizures as demonic possession and strokes as divine punishment. The library's archives contained surgical manuals describing cataract removals and tumor excisions with precision that medieval barber surgeons couldn't match. Without these guides, medicine didn't just stagnate, it spiraled backward, substituting observation with dogma. Consider the Hippocratic texts on epidemic diseases, which recognized contagion centuries before germ theory. Had these survived, might the Black Death have been met with quarantine protocols rather than scapegoating? The human toll is incalculable: generations suffering through trial and error treatments while the answers lay in ashes. Even basic hygiene practices documented in Alexandria, like wound cleaning with vinegar, were forgotten until modern times. The library's medical section wasn't just a collection of remedies, it was a roadmap to healthier civilizations, erased at the worst possible moment just as plagues began sweeping the collapsing Roman world. Now turn to mathematics, where the losses were equally catastrophic. The library's mathematicians had been on the verge of breakthroughs that would take centuries to rediscover. Archimedes' method of mechanical theorems, barely salvaged in a single surviving palimpsest, shows he was using infinitesimals, a precursor to calculus, to solve problems about volumes and centers of gravity. His techniques were so advanced that when this text was finally deciphered in the 20th century, historians realized medieval mathematicians had been reinventing wheels the ancient Greeks had already perfected. Euclid's Elements, survived by sheer luck. Copies had circulated beyond Alexandria, but what about his lost works? References suggest he wrote treatises on conic sections, an advanced number theory that could have accelerated mathematical progress by a millennium. And then there's Diophantus, whose surviving Arithmetica hints at early algebra, but the library held additional volumes where he might have solved problems that later stumped Fermat and Euler. The burning of these texts didn't just delay mathematics, it forced geniuses across the ages to solve puzzles that had already been cracked, wasting lifetimes on problems whose answers had once filled Alexandrian shelves. The most haunting loss isn't the solved equations we know were destroyed, it's the unsolved ones we'll never find. The library's catalog mentions works like On Unprovable Theorems and The Music of Primes, titles that suggest explorations into number theory and mathematical logic centuries ahead of their time. What if these scrolls contain the keys to Riemann's hypothesis or the Goldbach conjecture? The fire didn't just erase answers, it erased questions, entire branches of mathematics that might have blossomed had they survived. This mathematical amnesia had real-world consequences. Without Archimedes' engineering manuals, cathedral builders struggled with weight distribution, leading to collapses. Navigators lacking Eratosthenes' precise calculations took wrong turns that stranded expeditions. Even something as simple as double-entry bookkeeping, which could have stabilized ancient economies, had to be reinvented in medieval Italy because the original treatises were gone. The library's destruction didn't just rob scholars of elegant proof, it robbed societies of tools that could have eased suffering, fostered trade, and built sturdier futures. Yet amid these losses, a provocative question lingers: what if the fire's greatest casualty wasn't the knowledge itself, but the way it was organized? The library's true genius lay in its system. Cross-referenced catalogues linking medicine to botany, astronomy to geometry, creating a web of interdisciplinary insight. When those connections burned, humanity didn't just lose information, it lost the infrastructure for making new discoveries. The Dark Ages weren't dark because people forgot things, they were dark because people forgot how to connect them. And that's the lesson that still haunts us today. Knowledge isn't just what we know, but how we weave it together. Euclid's Elements is often celebrated as the foundation of geometry, a masterpiece of logical reasoning that shaped mathematics for millennia. But what few realize is that the Library of Alexandria held not just this iconic work, but drafts, commentaries, and alternative proofs that revealed how his ideas evolved. These lost texts could have given later mathematicians a roadmap showing not just the conclusions, but the creative process behind them. Instead, scholars from the Islamic Golden Age to the Renaissance had to reverse engineer Euclid's brilliance, wasting centuries reinventing methods that might have been learned in months had the library survived. Archimedes suffered an even greater eclipse. While fragments of his work on buoyancy and levers survived, the library housed his most advanced treatises, works where he calculated the area under curves using infinitesimals, a technique astonishingly close to modern calculus. When these texts burned, the world lost not just formulas, but a way of thinking. Imagine if Newton had inherited Archimedes' full legacy instead of working from scattered references. How much sooner might physics have unlocked the laws of motion? The delay wasn't academic. It meant slower progress in everything from architecture to navigation, as engineers lacked the mathematical tools to solve problems the ancients had already cracked. The ripple effects went beyond individual geniuses. The library's collections included Babylonian clay tablets with early algebraic methods, Indian texts on trigonometry, and Egyptian surveying techniques, all erased just as the ancient world needed them most. Roman aqueducts might have been more precisely engineered. Medieval cathedrals could have stood taller with better weight distribution. Even something as simple as accurate timekeeping, dependent on advanced geometry, lagged for centuries. Mathematics isn't just numbers on a page, it's the invisible scaffolding of civilization. Every equation lost in Alexandria's flames weakened that structure, forcing humanity to rebuild it brick by painstaking brick. And then there's the haunting question of what we don't know was lost. The library's catalog listed titles like On the Measurement of the Earth and The Harmony of Numbers, works that might have contained discoveries we still attribute to much later thinkers. When Copernicus proposed a sun-centered solar system, he had no idea Aristarchus had suggested the same thing 18 centuries earlier. That's the true tragedy. Not just the knowledge erased, but the generations of scholars who wasted lifetimes solving problems their predecessors had already answered. The library's destruction didn't just set back mathematics, it shattered the continuity of human thought, leaving us to grope through the dark for truths that had once been illuminated. Now consider astronomy, where the losses were just as profound. The library's observatories held star charts so precise they mapped planetary motions with near-modern accuracy. But when those records vanished, so did humanity's guide to the cosmos, and with it, our place in the universe. Astronomy wasn't just a subject in the Library of Alexandria. It was a living, breathing science, pulsating with discoveries that would take the rest of the world centuries to replicate. Take Aristarchus of Samos, whose surviving works hint that he'd not only proposed a heliocentric solar system, but had even calculated the relative distances between the Earth, Moon, and Sun using geometry alone. His methods were so precise that when Copernicus finally revived the idea of a sun-centered universe in the 16th century, he had no idea he was echoing a theory that had been formulated and then lost nearly 2,000 years earlier. The library's astronomers didn't just observe the heavens, they mapped them with a rigor that medieval Europe couldn't match. Star catalogues from Alexandria plotted the movements of planets with such accuracy that they accounted for subtle shifts invisible to the naked eye. Yet when these records burned, humanity's cosmic roadmap vanished, leaving later astronomers to puzzle over phenomena the ancients had already decoded. Then there's Hipparchus, whose star charts were so detailed they included coordinates for over 1,000 stars, along with theories about the precession of equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that alters our view of the constellations over millennia. His work was the foundation for Ptolemy's later Almagest, one of the few astronomical texts that survived the library's destruction. But imagine how much richer our understanding of the cosmos might be if Hipparchus' original observations had endured, giving later scholars not just conclusions but the raw data behind them. Without these records, even Galileo's telescopic discoveries in the 17th century were made in isolation, disconnected from the chain of inquiry that had once thrived in Alexandria's halls. The loss extended beyond theory into practical navigation. Eratosthenes' calculation of Earth's circumference, accurate to within 2%, wasn't just a mathematical triumph. It was a tool that could have guided explorers across oceans. Yet medieval mapmakers, lacking his work, reverted to flat Earth models that misjudged distances and doomed voyages. Arab astronomers preserved fragments of this knowledge, but the library's comprehensive texts integrating Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian astronomy were irreplaceable. The difference wasn't just in accuracy but in vision. Where Alexandrian scholars saw a universe governed by measurable laws, the medieval world often saw divine mystery. That shift didn't just slow progress, it changed the very questions humanity thought to ask about the stars. Now turn from the cosmos to literature, where the losses are just as staggering. The library's poetry section alone was said to span entire wings, housing works from every corner of the ancient world. Of Sophocles' 120 plays, only 7 survive today. The rest, tragedies that might have reshaped our understanding of Greek drama, were reduced to ash. Imagine discovering that Shakespeare's collected works had been whittled down to Hamlet and Macbeth, with the rest existing only as titles in a catalogue. That's the scale of what vanished in Alexandria. Even the epics we know are incomplete. The Iliad and Odyssey existed in multiple versions, some with alternative endings or additional books that didn't survive the fire. But the real tragedy lies in the works we'll never know existed. The library's holdings included histories of civilizations that left no other trace, love poems from cultures long silenced, and philosophical dialogues that challenged the very foundations of thought. One surviving fragment mentions a play called The Sack of Troy by a woman named Phaenarete, a rarity in male-dominated Greek theater. What insights might her perspective have offered? Another catalogue entry references The Laughing Philosopher, a collection of satirical essays mocking the intellectual fashions of Alexandria itself. These weren't just books, they were voices snuffed out before they could echo through time. The library's destruction didn't just rob us of stories, it narrowed the scope of human imagination. Every surviving ancient text we cherish today exists by chance, not design. For every Odyssey that endured, there were countless others that shaped their era only to vanish without a whisper. And that's the true cost of the flames, not just what we know was lost, but the infinite stories, ideas, and discoveries we'll never get to mourn because their very existence was erased from memory. Lost works of literature from the Library of Alexandria weren't just stories, they were windows into worlds we can now only glimpse through cracks in time. Aeschylus, the father of Greek tragedy, wrote over 90 plays, yet only 7 survive. Imagine what we've lost: entire trilogies like the Achilles, which explored the Trojan War with a depth that might have reshaped our understanding of Homer's epics. Or his satyr play, The Lion, a rare blend of myth and comedy that could have revealed a playful side of ancient drama we scarcely know. These weren't just entertainments, they were cultural touchstones, shaping how generations understood heroism, fate, and the gods. The library's shelves also held epic poems that vanished without a trace. Take the Thebaid, an early account of the Oedipus myth that might have predated Sophocles' version. What alternate interpretations of the doomed king's story were lost? Or consider Panyasis, Heraclea, a sprawling saga of Heracle's labors that rivaled Homer in popularity until the flames reduced it to ash. These works weren't just variations on familiar tales, they were competing visions of the ancient world, offering perspectives that could have challenged or enriched the narratives we've inherited. Historical chronicles suffered an even greater erasure. The library preserved eyewitness accounts of Alexander the Great's campaigns by his generals, offering unfiltered views of his conquests. These weren't dry military records, but vibrant narratives filled with cultural observations, descriptions of Indian philosophers debating Greek ambassadors, or Persian satraps navigating the collapse of their empire. When these texts burned, we didn't just lose facts, we lost the voices of those who shaped history, leaving later historians to piece together events through second-hand summaries and biased retellings. The most haunting losses are the works we know only by title. The catalogue mentions the Phoenician Wars by Diocles, a history of Carthage written from a Greek perspective that might have reshaped our view of Rome's greatest rival. Or The Ocean by Pythias, an explorer's account of voyages beyond the Mediterranean that could have contained the first descriptions of Celtic Britain or the Midnight Sun. These weren't just books, they were bridges to forgotten realities, burned before they could carry their truths across the centuries. Now consider the ripple effects. Without these texts, our cultural memory isn't just incomplete, it's distorted. The surviving works from antiquity weren't necessarily the best or most representative. They were the ones that happened to escape the fire. This randomness has skewed our perception of the ancient world, elevating some voices while silencing others. Take women's literature fragments suggest the library housed poems and essays by female scholars like Hypatia's predecessors, works that might have challenged the male-dominated canon we've inherited. Their absence has made history seem more monolithic than it truly was. And that's what makes the library's destruction so devastating. It didn't just erase the past, it narrowed our imagination of what the past could be. Every surviving scroll is a lottery winner, while the losers, equally brilliant, equally worthy, lie forgotten in the ashes. When we read Homer today, we're not just encountering ancient genius, we're seeing the shadow cast by the countless works that didn't make it. The fire didn't just burn paper and ink, It burned possibilities, alternate versions of history that might have changed how we see ourselves. This rewriting of history wasn't accidental. It was a consequence of how knowledge survives. The victors didn't just write history, they decided which histories got preserved, and in Alexandria, that power was wrested away not by conquerors but by flames. What remains is a puzzle with half the pieces missing, leaving us to wonder what picture might have emerged if the full set had survived. The first-hand accounts lost in Alexandria's flames weren't just historical footnotes, they were the lifeblood of our understanding of antiquity. Imagine holding a scroll written by an Egyptian scribe who chronicled the reign of Cleopatra, or a Persian diplomat's diary detailing negotiations with Alexander the Great. These weren't dry recitations of events. They pulsed with the voices of people who shaped empires, witnessed revolutions, and navigated the complexities of daily life in a world now vanished. When these records burned, we didn't just lose dates and names, we lost the texture of history itself. The library's archives contained tax records revealing trade routes, personal letters exposing court intrigues, even mundane shopping lists that could have reconstructed the rhythms of ancient markets. Without these fragments, entire civilizations appear frozen in time, reduced to broad strokes rather than living, breathing societies. Take something as fundamental as the Ptolemies' rule over Egypt. The library housed original decrees, administrative reports, and even gossip from the royal court, materials that could have revealed how power truly functioned behind the palace walls. Instead, historians are left piecing together the dynasty's story from second-hand accounts and fragmentary inscriptions, like trying to reconstruct a shattered mosaic with half the tiles missing. The same gaps haunt our knowledge of Persia's Achaemenid Empire. One surviving reference mentions a multi-volume history by Ctesias, a Greek physician at the Persian court, who recorded everything from medical practices to royal succession struggles. But the library's copy was destroyed, leaving us with only later scholars' cherry-picked quotations, often biased or taken out of context. This erosion of detail has real consequences. When Rome later emulated aspects of Persian governance, they worked from incomplete models, potentially misunderstanding systems that could have informed better administration. Military historians still debate basic questions about Alexander's tactics because the eyewitness accounts of his generals, once shelved in Alexandria, are gone. Even something as simple as ancient dietary habits remains speculative. The library's cookbooks and agricultural manuals could have revealed how nutrition shaped societies, but now we're left guessing at the ingredients of history's most famous feasts. Now shift from politics to economics, where the losses are equally staggering. The library's ledgers and trade logs didn't just track transactions, they encoded the DNA of ancient commerce. Papyri detailing the grain trade between Egypt and Rome could have shown how price fluctuations triggered political unrest. Shipping manifests from the Red Sea ports might have rewritten our understanding of globalization's early roots, revealing networks that stretched to India and beyond. Instead, we're left with scattered clues, like trying to map a continent from a handful of disconnected landmarks. Consider the economic theories that perished. The library held treatises on everything from Athenian monetary policy to Carthaginian resource management, ideas that could have informed medieval economies struggling with coin shortages and inflation. When these texts burned, Europe had to relearn principles of supply and demand through trial and error, a process that took centuries. Even basic innovations like standardized weights and measures, which the library's engineers had refined, had to be reinvented piecemeal across medieval market towns. The cost wasn't just academic, it was measured in generations of inefficient trade, unstable currencies, and avoidable famines. The most profound economic loss, though, might be the library's own role as an intellectual marketplace. Scholars from across the ancient world came to Alexandria not just to read, but to exchange ideas that sparked new industries. The same institution that advanced astronomy also hosted debates on agricultural techniques that could have revolutionized crop yields. Its medical researchers collaborated with traders to identify medicinal plants from distant lands. This cross-pollination of knowledge was itself an economic engine, one that ground to a halt when the fires swept through. Without that central hub, innovation became siloed, slowing the spread of technologies that could have boosted productivity across the ancient world. Yet amid these losses, a haunting question lingers: what if the greatest economic casualty wasn't the knowledge itself, but the mindset it fostered? The library proved that investing in knowledge yielded tangible returns, from improved navigation for merchants to better engineering for public works. Its destruction didn't just erase information, it undermined the very idea that knowledge was worth preserving at scale. For centuries afterward, rulers saw libraries as luxuries rather than infrastructure, slowing the reinvestment in collective learning that could have accelerated progress. The fire's true cost wasn't just the scrolls that burned, it was the future investments that never happened. Imagine entire cities built with techniques from the Library of Alexandria, aqueducts designed with Archimedes' precise hydraulic calculations, harbors engineered to withstand storms using Hero's mechanical principles, or granaries employing ventilation systems described in lost agricultural texts. The economic ripple effects of these vanished innovations are almost incalculable. Ancient Rome's architects, for instance, struggled with concrete formulations that the library's chemists might have perfected, leading to structures that crumbled centuries sooner than they should have. Medieval farmers, lacking access to Alexandrian treatises on crop rotation and soil management, exhausted their fields, triggering famines that destabilized kingdoms. Trade routes suffered equally devastating setbacks. The library housed detailed maps of monsoon patterns used by Greek and Egyptian merchants to cross the Indian Ocean, knowledge that later sailors had to relearn through perilous trial and error. Without these navigational guides, spices and silks took years longer to reach European markets, driving up costs and limiting economic exchange. Even something as fundamental as currency could have evolved differently. Alexandrian economists had documented experiments with standardized coinage and early banking systems, ideas that medieval mints rediscovered only after centuries of chaotic barter economies. The cultural cost of these economic delays runs even deeper. When societies must constantly reinvent basic technologies, they have fewer resources to devote to art, philosophy, or social progress. The Renaissance didn't just rediscover ancient knowledge, it reclaimed centuries of lost time, time that could have been spent pushing boundaries rather than rebuilding foundations. Picture a world where Gothic cathedrals rose alongside public hospitals, where merchant fleets funded universities instead of wars. The library's loss didn't just erase information, it altered the trajectory of human priorities, forcing cultures to focus on survival over innovation. Now consider the intangible losses, the collaborative networks that once thrived in Alexandria's shadow. The library wasn't just a storehouse, it was a matchmaker for ideas, connecting botanists with physicians, astronomers with navigators. When those connections burned, so did the interdisciplinary breakthroughs they might have sparked. A medieval alchemist working alone might never realize his observations about metals could revolutionize pottery glazes, just as a shipbuilder wouldn't know his hull designs could inspire windmill mechanics. The economic toll of these missed connections is invisible but profound. 1,000 industries that never blossomed because the seeds of collaboration were ashes. Yet the most haunting question isn't about what was lost, but what never had the chance to exist. The library's scholars were already asking questions about automation, renewable energy, and even early computing dreams that might have jump-started industrial revolutions before the Dark Ages. Their unrealized ideas linger like ghost roads on history's map, paths we might have traveled if the flames hadn't closed them off. And that's the true cultural tragedy, not just the knowledge that vanished, but the futures that were never imagined. A cultural dark age, the library's destruction didn't just erase facts, it silenced voices. Diverse perspectives from across the ancient world were lost, narrowing the scope of human thought. The dominance of certain ideologies over others can be traced back to this loss, but could anything have been saved? Let's explore the myths and realities. The silencing of these voices wasn't just about missing scrolls. It reshaped the very fabric of intellectual history. Alexandria's collections included Zoroastrian hymns from Persia, Buddhist treatises from India, and Jewish commentaries that bridged Hellenistic and Near Eastern thought. These weren't just alternative viewpoints, they were entire worldviews, philosophies that could have challenged and enriched the dominant Greek and Roman traditions. When the flames consumed them, the conversation of humanity narrowed overnight. Suddenly, ideas that had once been debated openly became fringe, then forgotten. The rise of monotheistic religions in later centuries unfolded without the tempering influence of these pluralistic dialogues, leaving fewer avenues for dissent or synthesis. Consider the case of Hypatia, the mathematician and philosopher murdered by a Christian mob in 415 CE. Her death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it symbolized the extinguishing of Alexandria's legacy as a haven for free inquiry. The library had once hosted scholars who blended Egyptian astronomy with Greek metaphysics, who saw no contradiction between reason and faith. But as its collections dwindled, so did the intellectual diversity they sustained. The medieval world inherited a fragmented cultural landscape, where certain ideas were elevated as orthodoxy while others were relegated to heresy, not because they lacked merit, but because the texts that might have defended them were ashes. Could anything have been salvaged? Rumors persist that some scrolls were smuggled to safety, hidden in monastic vaults or carried eastward by fleeing scholars. A few precious works did survive this way, copies of Euclid preserved in Baghdad, fragments of Galen's medical texts rescued by Syrian translators, but these were drops in an ocean. The vast majority of the library's holdings had no backups, no second chances. Even the famous story that Muslims burned the library's remains in the 7th century obscures a harsher truth. By then, the collection was already a ghost of itself, its greatest treasures long lost to earlier fires and neglect. The myths surrounding the library's end often focus on dramatic flames, but the real tragedy was slower and quieter. It wasn't just about what burned, it was about what stopped being copied, what ceased to be discussed. Texts that weren't deemed useful or orthodox by later generations were left to crumble, their ink fading as surely as if they'd been tossed into a furnace. The dominance of certain ideas wasn't always enforced by violence. Sometimes it was just the weight of silence, the absence of alternatives, yet the library's ghost lingers. Every time a medieval manuscript is discovered in some forgotten archive, palimpsest beneath a later text, it's a reminder of how close we came to losing even more. These fragments are whispers from a world that might have been one where multiple truths coexisted, where the borders between cultures were bridges rather than walls. The fire didn't just destroy books, it rewired humanity's collective mind, privileging some thoughts while erasing others. And that's the hardest loss to measure. Not the knowledge we know is gone, but the conversations we'll never get to have. Even in the ashes of Alexandria, tiny embers of its wisdom survived. A handful of texts escaped the flames through sheer luck, copies made by scholars who traveled to Rome or Byzantium, scrolls borrowed and never returned, treatises translated into Syriac or Arabic before the fire. Euclid's Elements lived on because it had been copied so widely. Archimedes' works, though fragmented, were preserved in Constantinople. Galen's medical writings found refuge in monastic libraries, where monks painstakingly recopied them for centuries. These scattered survivors are like single puzzle pieces from a vast mosaic, hints of what once was, but never enough to reconstruct the whole picture. The survival of these fragments came down to chance and necessity. Texts deemed practical medical manuals, agricultural guides, geometric proofs were more likely to be copied and preserved. But the poetry, the philosophy, the radical ideas that challenged orthodoxy, those often perished first. Imagine a medieval monk choosing which scrolls to save as invaders approached. Would he prioritize a treatise on steam engines or a psalm he could recite for comfort? The knowledge that survived wasn't necessarily the most groundbreaking. It was the most immediately useful, or the most aligned with the beliefs of those doing the preserving. And yet, tantalizing myths persist. For centuries, explorers and scholars have chased rumors of hidden caches, secret rooms beneath Alexandria's ruins, forgotten chests in desert monasteries, even tales that Mark Antony gifted Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from Pergamon's library as a wedding present, a collection that might still lie undiscovered. In the 1200s, the Arab historian Ibn al-Kifti claimed that when Caliph Omar ordered the library's remains burned, a handful of scholars smuggled out scrolls in hollowed-out bread loaves. Could these stories hold a grain of truth? Modern archaeologists still scour the Mediterranean for clues, hoping to find even a single shelf's worth of surviving texts. The most heartbreaking possibility isn't that these lost works are gone forever. It's that they might still exist, crumbling in some overlooked attic or buried beneath modern streets. In 2008, researchers using multispectral imaging uncovered previously invisible writing on the Archimedes palimpsest, a prayer book that had been scrubbed clean and reused, its original mathematical text faint beneath the surface. How many other lost works might still linger this way, their ink faded but not erased? The irony is cruel. The very act of recycling parchment, meant to preserve knowledge by reusing scarce materials, may have unknowingly destroyed irreplaceable texts. Then came the Renaissance, when Europe awoke from its intellectual slumber and began desperately trying to reassemble Alexandria's ghost. Scholars scoured the surviving libraries of the Islamic world, where Arabic translations of Greek works had been safeguarded. They pored over monastery archives, decoding palimpsests and fragments, but the task was like reconstructing a symphony from a few scattered notes, possible in theory, but forever lacking the full richness of the original. What emerged was a patchwork revival, brilliant but incomplete. The Renaissance didn't just rediscover antiquity, it reinvented it, filling in the gaps with inspired guesses that sometimes missed the mark entirely. Consider the case of Plato's dialogues. Of the dozens he supposedly wrote, only about half survived, and even those were filtered through centuries of interpretation. Without the full corpus, Renaissance thinkers had to guess at his true philosophy, leading to debates we'll never resolve. The same problem haunted science. When Copernicus revived Aristarchus' heliocentric model, he had no way of knowing how much further the original theory had gone. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth, it was a reconstruction project working from half-burned blueprints, and that's the lingering tragedy of the library's loss. Even when fragments survived, they were stripped of context, like pages torn from a novel, leaving us to wonder about the chapters in between. The Renaissance didn't just reclaim lost knowledge, it exposed how much had slipped through our fingers forever. Every rediscovery was bittersweet, a reminder of how much more there once was, and how little we'll ever truly recover. The Renaissance promised a rebirth of ancient wisdom, but what returned was a mere echo of Alexandria's lost brilliance. Scholars scouring the libraries of Baghdad and Constantinople uncovered Arabic translations of Greek texts, fragments preserved by Muslim and Byzantine scribes who had safeguarded them through the darkest centuries. Aristotle's logic, Ptolemy's astronomy, and Hippocrates' medicine re-entered Europe like long-lost travelers welcome, yet forever changed by their journey. But these survivors were the exceptions, not the rule. For every recovered work, a dozen more remained ash. The Renaissance wasn't a resurrection. It was a salvage operation, piecing together a shattered mosaic with half the tiles missing. Consider the gaps in this partial revival. When Leonardo da Vinci sketched his flying machines, he had no idea that Hero of Alexandria had already designed mechanical birds powered by steam. Copernicus spent decades calculating planetary motions, unaware that Aristarchus had mapped a sun-centered cosmos 18 centuries earlier. Even Shakespeare, whose plays brim with classical allusions, could only access a sliver of the tragedies and comedies that once filled Alexandria's shelves. The Renaissance mind, for all its genius, was working with a fraction of the toolkit its ancient predecessors had possessed. The limitations of this revival ripple through modern science. Newton's calculus might have emerged decades sooner had Archimedes' complete works on infinitesimals survived. Medical pioneers like Vesalius dissected cadavers in the 1500s, reinventing discoveries Herophilus had made in Alexandria's halls 17 centuries prior. Every eureka moment of the Renaissance carried an unspoken footnote. Someone had likely shouted it first, their voice silenced by the fire. Yet the most poignant parallel lies in how we handle knowledge today. Digital archives promise to preserve humanity's collective wisdom, yet link rot erases online content faster than papyrus decays. The Library of Alexandria's destruction reminds us that no repository is permanent, not stone tablets, not cloud servers. When Twitter's servers went offline in 2023, historians lamented the loss of millions of tweets documenting wars and social movements. Our era faces its own Alexandrian dilemma: how to safeguard fragile knowledge in formats that may not outlast clay tablets. The lesson isn't just about backup drives or fireproof vaults. Alexandria's true legacy is a warning about centralized systems. The library amassed the ancient world's knowledge in one vulnerable place. Today, we replicate that risk when corporations control access to academic journals or when social media platforms act as arbiters of truth. The Renaissance survived because copies were scattered. Monte Cassino's monks, Toledo's translators, and Baghdad's scholars each preserved shards. Our modern challenge is to distribute knowledge as widely as the internet reaches, while ensuring it remains as durable as vellum. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't about what was lost, but what we're failing to preserve now. Future historians may sift through our digital age's ruins, wondering why we let climate data vanish behind paywalls or allowed algorithms to prioritize viral trends over substantive scholarship. The fire that consumed Alexandria didn't just burn parchment, it exposed how fragile civilization's memory can be, and that's a flame we're still learning to outrun. Modern libraries stand as monuments to Alexandria's legacy, but they also inherit its vulnerabilities. The Library of Congress, with its millions of volumes and petabytes of digital data, embodies humanity's determination to preserve knowledge. Yet even this fortress of learning isn't immune to the threats that felled Alexandria, not just fire and war, but subtler dangers like bit rot, where digital files degrade silently over time. Imagine a hard drive from the 1990s, its contents now unreadable without obsolete software, or a social media platform shutting down, taking with it decades of cultural conversation. Digital archives promise immortality, but their lifespans can be shockingly brief compared to parchment that survived 2 millennia in desert caves. The irony is stark. We've never had more tools to preserve knowledge, yet never faced more ways to lose it. Ancient scrolls burned in minutes, but modern data vanishes in milliseconds through server crashes, cyber attacks, or even corporate decisions. When a streaming service removes a film, it disappears as completely as an Alexandrian tragedy. Governments can erase inconvenient histories with a keystroke, just as medieval censors scraped palimpsests clean. And while the internet seems vast, much of it exists on fragile, centralized platforms echoing Alexandria's fatal flaw of housing too much in one vulnerable place. Yet the greatest threat isn't technology, it's complacency. We assume cloud storage is eternal, forgetting how quickly floppy disks became relics. Projects like the Internet Archive and UNESCO Memory of the World program fight this tide, creating redundant copies in multiple countries, much like medieval monks scattering manuscripts across monasteries. But preservation requires constant vigilance. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived by accident in arid caves. Today's digital equivalents need deliberate, global effort. Could another Alexandria happen? The answer lies not in predicting disasters, but in learning from them. When Russia's invasion of Ukraine targeted libraries and museums, volunteers raced to digitize collections, proving history's lessons can inspire action. The real test isn't whether we'll face another catastrophe, but whether we'll build systems resilient enough to outlast it. Alexandria's ghost whispers a warning. Knowledge isn't lost in an instant, but through countless small neglects. This time, we have no excuse not to listen. History never truly repeats, but it whispers warnings across the centuries, and the fall of Alexandria's library echoes louder now than ever. In our digital age, where information seems infinite and indestructible, we're actually facing threats more insidious than flames. Dead links erase online articles faster than scrolls decay. Social media algorithms prioritize viral falsehoods over verified facts. Even the cloud, that modern myth of permanence, is vulnerable to corporate collapses or cyber attacks. The irony is staggering. We've built the greatest repository of knowledge in human history, yet we're losing pieces daily through sheer neglect. Take something as simple as hyperlinks. Studies show over 50% of links in academic papers from the 1990s are already broken, what historians call reference rot. Legal cases, scientific breakthroughs, even entire government reports vanish when websites reorganize or shut down. It's as if someone set fire to an archive every time a company goes bankrupt. And unlike Alexandria's physical scrolls, digital data often leaves no ashes, just silent gaps where truth used to be. Misinformation spreads this vacuum. When accurate sources disappear, conspiracy theories rush in like water filling a sinkhole. During the 2020 pandemic, researchers watched as debunked COVID treatments circulated unchecked while reputable studies sat behind paywalls. This isn't just about convenience, it's about how easily modern society could face its own dark age, not from fire or war, but from fractured access and eroded trust. Yet solutions exist if we learn from Alexandria's mistakes. Distributed preservation is key, not one library, but thousands. Projects like the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine save snapshots of websites globally. Blockchain experiments are testing ways to timestamp research so it can't be altered or erased. Even simple acts matter. Librarians now train activists to download and store crucial datasets on portable drives, creating data bunkers that outlast server crashes. The real lesson of Alexandria isn't just about loss, it's about responsibility. Ancient scholars didn't have our tools, but we lacked their urgency. They knew knowledge was fragile, so they copied, debated, and carried scrolls across continents. Today, we must become that relentless. Every time you download a study instead of just bookmarking it, every time you archive a tweet documenting injustice, you're fighting the fire before it starts. Because the next Alexandria won't burn in a day, it'll fade, one unbacked up file at a time. The burning of Alexandria's library forces us to confront a haunting question. What does it mean to truly preserve knowledge? It's not enough to simply store information. We have to ensure it remains alive, accessible, and woven into the fabric of human understanding. Modern initiatives like open access archives and decentralized digital storage aren't just technical solutions. They're philosophical statements about who gets to shape the future. When research papers sit behind paywalls or social media platforms vanish overnight, we're repeating the same mistakes that turned Alexandria's wisdom to ash. The difference now is that we have the tools to do better, if we choose to use them. Take the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, a sprawling digital time capsule that has preserved over 700 billion web pages since 1996. Unlike static libraries, it captures the Internet's fleeting nature, recording everything from news sites to obscure forums before they disappear. This isn't just backup storage. It's a radical act of democratization, ensuring a teenager in Nairobi has the same access to historical records as a professor at Oxford. Yet even this ambitious project is fragile, reliant on donations and legal battles to keep its servers running. The lesson is clear: preservation isn't a one-time act, but a continuous fight against entropy and indifference. Decentralized technologies offer another path forward. Blockchain-based archives like Arweave store data across thousands of computers worldwide, making it nearly impossible to erase. Imagine if every scroll in Alexandria had been copied onto tablets buried in 100 cities. No single fire could have wiped them all out. Modern projects apply this principle to everything from academic research to indigenous storytelling, creating redundant networks where knowledge survives even if individual nodes fail. But here's the catch: these systems only work if we prioritize accessibility over profit. A blockchain ledger is useless if the keys to decrypt it are held by a corporation that could vanish tomorrow. The deeper philosophical shift lies in redefining what we consider worth saving. Ancient librarians painstakingly copied texts they deemed essential, often discarding works that challenged prevailing beliefs. Today, algorithms make similar judgments, invisibly boosting viral content while letting niche scholarship languish in obscurity. Projects like Wikipedia's Sum of All Knowledge mission attempt to counter this, but they rely on volunteers fighting an uphill battle against bias and burnout. Preservation isn't just about technology. It's about valuing the messy, inconvenient diversity of human thought. Perhaps the most profound insight from Alexandria's ashes is this: knowledge isn't lost in dramatic bonfires, but in countless small silences. Every time a scientist can't afford to publish openly, every time a community's oral history goes unrecorded, we're burning scrolls no one will ever miss until it's too late. The antidote isn't just better hard drives, but a cultural commitment to treating knowledge as a shared inheritance, not a commodity. When we scatter seeds instead of hoarding them in one fragile basket, we honor Alexandria's legacy not through mourning, but through action. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria forces us to confront a profound truth about civilization. Progress isn't just about discovering new ideas, it's about not losing the old ones. Think of knowledge as a ladder where each rung represents a discovery built upon the ones below it. When those rungs vanish, humanity is left clinging to the remaining steps, forced to stretch farther or risk falling back. The library's burning didn't just erase scrolls, it removed entire footholds in our collective climb toward understanding. Historians like Luciano Canfora argue that the loss set off a chain reaction of stagnation, where later scholars wasted centuries retracing steps their predecessors had already mapped. But here's the unsettling twist: we'll never know exactly how much farther we could have gone. Imagine if Newton had inherited Archimedes' complete works on calculus instead of scattered fragments. Would the Industrial Revolution have arrived 200 years earlier? Might we have cured diseases or harnessed renewable energy before fossil fuels reshaped the planet? The library's absence isn't just a gap in history, it's a void filled with alternate timelines we can only glimpse in fragments. Historians like Diana Delia point to a sobering pattern. Civilizations that lose access to their intellectual heritage often regress before they advance. After Alexandria, Europe endured centuries where basic astronomical knowledge, like the Earth's roundness, was debated as if it were a new idea. Meanwhile, in Baghdad and Cordoba, Arabic translations of surviving Greek texts kept the flame alive, proving how fragile progress is when knowledge isn't redundantly preserved. The difference between the Islamic Golden Age and Europe's Dark Ages wasn't just about innovation, it was about access. Yet some scholars like Roger Bagnall offer a counterpoint. Maybe the library's legend overshadows its practical impact. Even at its height, he argues, only a tiny elite could read its scrolls. Would those texts really have accelerated progress in a world without printing presses or widespread literacy? It's a provocative question, but one that misses the bigger picture. The library wasn't just a storage room, it was an ecosystem. Like a rainforest harboring undiscovered medical cures in its plants, Alexandria's shelves held connections no single scholar could foresee. Lose one thread, and you might unravel a tapestry of potential breakthroughs. The most compelling insight comes from historian Maria Dzielska, who frames the loss as a warning about centralized knowledge. Alexandria's tragedy wasn't just the fire, it was the lack of copies. Today, as we digitize humanity's archives, we face the same risk, storing our collective memory on servers controlled by a handful of corporations. The lesson isn't to abandon great libraries, but to scatter their equivalents everywhere, from rural server farms to lunar backup drives. Because the value of knowledge isn't just in having it, but in ensuring it survives the next great fire, whether literal or digital. So when we ask how much progress depends on preserving the past, the answer lies in recognizing that history isn't linear. It's a fragile web where every broken strand forces us to reweave the pattern. The library's ghost reminds us that civilization's greatest threat isn't ignorance, it's amnesia. And in an age where data can vanish with a keystroke, that warning has never been more urgent. Historians continue to clash over the Library of Alexandria's true impact on the trajectory of civilization. But one thing unites them: the loss was nothing short of a seismic rupture in human progress. Scholar James Hannam makes a compelling case that the library's destruction didn't just slow advancement, it fundamentally altered the rhythm of discovery. Before the fire, breakthroughs built directly on earlier insights, creating a steady upward climb. Afterward, humanity cycled through periods of brilliance and amnesia, like a student forced to relearn the same lesson every century. Yet not all experts see the loss as an absolute disaster. Historian Richard Carrier counters that the library's influence was always limited to a tiny elite, arguing that even intact, its scrolls wouldn't have reached the farmers, artisans, and merchants whose labor drove societal change. The most provocative theory comes from classicist Mary Beard, who suggests the library's mythical status today outstrips its actual historical role. She points out that other great centers of learning, like Baghdad's House of Wisdom, flourished later without Alexandria's resources. proving knowledge could rebound from even the worst catastrophes. But here's the twist. It's not the physical scrolls that mattered most, but the ecosystem they sustained. The library wasn't just a warehouse. It was a marketplace of ideas where Egyptian astronomers debated Greek mathematicians, where medical dissections informed architectural innovations. That cross-pollination couldn't be easily rebuilt once scattered. Now let's untangle the myths that swirl around this ancient tragedy. Contrary to popular belief, the library didn't vanish in a single apocalyptic blaze. Its decline was a slow unraveling fires, yes, but also neglect, censorship, and the simple rot of time. Another persistent fiction paints the library as a lone beacon in a dark world. In reality, it was part of a vibrant network stretching from Rome to India, though none matched its scale. The most dangerous misconception that the loss was inevitable. Political choices, not fate, sealed its doom. When Christian mobs targeted pagan institutions or Muslim rulers repurposed its remnants, these weren't acts of barbarism, but calculated moves to control knowledge itself. The debate over Alexandria's legacy ultimately forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how civilizations preserve truth. Do we, like the Ptolemies, aggressively archive every perspective? Or do we, like later rulers, privilege certain narratives while letting others fade? The library's ghost lingers not just in what was burned, but in what we choose to save or sacrifice today. One of the most persistent myths about the Library of Alexandria is the image of a single, catastrophic fire wiping out all its treasures in one dramatic night. Hollywood loves this version: flames engulfing marble columns, scholars desperately clutching scrolls as the world's knowledge vanishes in smoke. But the truth is far more complicated and in many ways more tragic. The library didn't fall in a day. It suffered a slow unraveling across centuries, a death by 1,000 cuts. The famous fire during Caesar's siege in 48 BCE was devastating, but it only destroyed a portion of the collection, likely around 40,000 scrolls out of hundreds of thousands. The library limped on for generations, its scholars continuing their work even as its prestige dimmed. Another misconception is that Alexandria's destruction plunged the world into immediate darkness. In reality, fragments of its knowledge survived through scattered copies and alternative repositories. Byzantine monasteries preserved Greek medical texts. Arab translators in Baghdad saved Aristotle's works. Even the legendary House of Wisdom in 9th century Baghdad became a successor of sorts, inheriting the torch of cross-cultural scholarship. But here's the crucial distinction: while individual works survived, the ecosystem didn't. The library wasn't just a building with scrolls, it was a living network where Egyptian astronomers debated Indian mathematicians, where medical dissections informed architectural innovations. That web of connections couldn't be photocopied. The most dangerous myth, though, is the idea that the loss was inevitable, somehow the natural order of things. In truth, the library's decline was shaped by deliberate choices. When Christian mobs targeted pagan institutions in the 4th century, or when later rulers prioritized dogma over dialogue, these weren't acts of fate but political calculations about who controlled knowledge. Even the final whispers of the library's collection, reportedly burned as fuel during the 7th century Muslim conquest, reflect a chilling pragmatism. When knowledge isn't valued, it becomes kindling. Separating fact from fiction matters because it changes how we measure the loss. The tragedy wasn't just the scrolls that burned, but the conversations they could have sparked, the discoveries that might have emerged from their collision with new ideas. Imagine a medieval scholar reading Aristotle's heliocentric theory alongside Copernicus' notes, or a Renaissance surgeon studying Herophilus' nerve diagrams. The library's true value wasn't just its contents, but the potential it housed, and that potential, once scattered, could never be fully reassembled. Now turn to how artists have interpreted this story across centuries, because how we imagine the library's end reveals just as much about our own fears as it does about history. Paintings and films overwhelmingly depict the destruction as a single, fiery cataclysm, often with white-robed scholars weeping over the flames. These images resonate because they tap into a universal anxiety, the fragility of human achievement. But they also simplify something profoundly messy: the slow erosion of curiosity by bureaucracy, the quiet censorship of inconvenient ideas, the way civilizations can forget as much as they learn. From 18th century engravings to modern video games, these depictions rarely show the library's gradual decline. The empty lecture halls, the unchallenged dogmas piling up like unread scrolls. Perhaps that's because a slow death lacks drama, or perhaps it's too uncomfortably familiar. After all, our own digital age faces its own creeping threats: not flames, but link rot; not mobs, but algorithms that prioritize engagement over truth. The library's ghost warns us that knowledge isn't lost in grand explosions, but in countless small silences, and that's a lesson no single painting could ever capture. The haunting image of the Library of Alexandria in flames has inspired artists for centuries, each retelling adding new layers to its mythos. Films like Agora dramatize Hypatia's final days, casting the library's destruction as a clash between reason and dogma, while documentaries pore over archaeological clues, piecing together what might have been. These portrayals rarely stick to historical accuracy. Agora condenses decades of turmoil into a single narrative, and popular novels often imagine secret caches of scrolls hidden beneath the city. Yet their power lies not in factual precision, but in how they channel the library's essence, a beacon of collective human aspiration snuffed out too soon. What makes this ancient tragedy so irresistible to modern storytellers? Part of it is the sheer scale of the loss, a universal "what if" that sparks the imagination. But deeper still, the library represents a fear that resonates across time: the fragility of knowledge itself. In an age of digital overload, where misinformation spreads faster than truth, the idea that an entire civilization's wisdom could vanish in a single fire feels less like ancient history and more like a warning. The library's story taps into our anxiety about how easily progress can unravel, how quickly the pillars of understanding might crumble. Artistic depictions also grapple with the library's dual nature, both a real place and a metaphor. In Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, a medieval monastery's labyrinthine library echoes Alexandria's lost archives, its secrets guarded by violence. Video games like Assassin's Creed Origins let players wander a painstakingly reconstructed virtual library, blending historical detail with mythic grandeur. These creative liberties aren't just dramatic flourishes, they're attempts to capture the emotional weight of the loss, to make palpable the void left by those burned scrolls. Yet the most poignant portrayals are often the quietest. Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics imagine the library as an endless dreamscape, where every book ever conceived exists, including those burned in Alexandria. It's a fantasy of restoration, a balm for the historian's grief. Similarly, Carl Sagan's Cosmos devoted an entire segment to the library, not just mourning its destruction but celebrating its spirit of inquiry. These works remind us that the library's true legacy isn't the scrolls it lost, but the ideal it embodied, a world where knowledge transcends borders and curiosity is sacred. Perhaps that's why the library endures in popular memory. It's not just about the past, it's a mirror for our present struggles. When documentaries highlight modern digitization efforts, or when activists invoke Alexandria to warn against censorship, they're reclaiming the library's mission for a new age. The flames that consumed its halls didn't just erase ancient texts, they ignited a symbol, one that still lights the way toward a future where knowledge is cherished, shared, and fiercely protected. And in that sense, the library never truly burned at all, it just transformed. The story of Alexandria's library isn't just a tale of ancient tragedy, it's a mirror held up to our own relationship with knowledge. That fragile scroll, that whispered idea, that groundbreaking theory scribbled in ink, none of them are safe from the erosions of time, the carelessness of conflict, or the quiet tyranny of neglect. The real legacy of Alexandria isn't just what was lost, but what we've done or failed to do to prevent it from happening again. Look around today, and you'll see the same patterns playing out in slow motion. When a university library discards rare journals to make space for cafes, when a tech company shuts down a platform and erases decades of digital conversation, when governments restrict access to archives, these aren't just inconveniences. They're tiny echoes of that ancient fire, repeating the same fatal mistake, treating knowledge as disposable. But here's the twist we've also learned from Alexandria's ashes. Modern efforts to safeguard knowledge are direct responses to its loss. Project Gutenberg's free digital library, the Internet Archive's sprawling backups, even Wikipedia's crowdsourced articles, all of them embody Alexandria's original mission, but with a critical upgrade: decentralization. Unlike the Ptolemies, who gathered scrolls in one vulnerable place, we're now scattering copies across servers, hard drives, and even lunar time capsules. The lesson is clear: knowledge survives when it's shared, not hoarded. Yet the deepest wound left by Alexandria's destruction isn't measured in lost texts, but in lost time. Think of the centuries humanity spent relearning what the library's scholars already knew, the wasted potential of generations stuck reinventing wheels instead of racing forward. That delay shaped everything from medicine to space exploration, leaving us with a haunting question: where would we be today if that chain of discovery had never been broken? The answer isn't just in the past. It's a warning for our own era, where shortcuts and misinformation threaten to derail progress once more. The library's final lesson isn't about lamenting what's gone, it's about fighting for what remains. Every time a scientist chooses open access publishing over paywalls, every time an archivist digitizes a crumbling manuscript, every time a teacher shares forbidden books with students, they're defying Alexandria's fate. Because knowledge isn't fragile when it's alive in the minds of people, when it's passed hand to hand like a torch in the dark. The flames that consumed those scrolls couldn't erase the human hunger to understand, to question, to reach farther. And that's the legacy that still burns brightest, not what was taken from us, but what we've chosen to rebuild. The burning of the Library of Alexandria wasn't just the loss of books, it was the silencing of countless voices and ideas that could have changed the world. Think of all the ways history might have unfolded differently if those scrolls had survived. Would we have cured diseases centuries earlier? Would space travel be more than a dream by now? The library's destruction didn't just erase the past, it stole futures we'll never get to see. But here's the thing, we're still writing this story. The same forces that burned Alexandria, ignorance, dogma, the reckless destruction of knowledge haven't disappeared. They've just taken new forms. When entire languages go extinct because no one bothers to record them, when scientific research gets buried behind paywalls, when social media algorithms prioritize conspiracy theories over facts, we're watching history repeat itself. The lesson of Alexandria isn't just about mourning what's gone. It's about recognizing how fragile knowledge still is, even in our digital age. yet there's hope in how we respond. Every time someone uploads a rare manuscript to the internet, every time a teacher inspires students to question and explore, every time a community fights to preserve its history, we're rebuilding Alexandria's legacy. The library's true spirit wasn't in its marble halls or its 500,000 scrolls. It was in the simple, radical idea that knowledge belongs to everyone. That's why this story matters today more than ever. So what can we do? Start small. Support libraries and archives, whether they're down the street or online. Share reliable sources, not just viral myths, and most importantly, stay curious. The greatest tribute to Alexandria isn't just preserving what we know, it's keeping alive the hunger to learn more. Because the next great discovery, the next world-changing idea, could be sitting in a notebook somewhere right now. Let's make sure it doesn't end up as ashes. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. What piece of lost knowledge do you wish we could recover? And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold chapters. Together, we can keep the flame of curiosity burning. After all, that's how libraries truly live on, not in buildings but in the minds of those who dare to ask.